Thank you so much.
People coming in, so we're going to start about 5 minutes. I'm sorry about slightly running a little bit late, but still people pouring in. So they will continue to do so for the next 5 minutes, and then we'll start whether they're in or not.
Whenever I see the no, I'm not too I may not be there in the morning. I watched it. Yeah, we stayed in the white car. No, I haven't been out So you have to bring us down and see when it gets a bit quiet. A baby weasel, very, very cute, very friendly. Also helped me on my Golden Point map.
Hooray! That's easy. Thanks. So, my name's Peter McFadian. I'm the leader of Frome Town Council, and my job is very simple this evening. It's really to say hello and welcome. It's not finished. Now, I've got a few other words I want to say as well. I want to welcome all of you lot. You probably realise that part of the delay is that we're joined by millions of people all over the planet. In fact, I can't help believing that there's probably more people watching in here than there are. humankind has made something of a mess of some things. And we desperately need some really good ideas. And it's my hope and belief that we're here tonight to hear some of them. So no pressure. And I just really want to finish on that note and thank you again for coming and for watching. And I'm going to hand over to Simon King, who lives just on the borders of Frome, so he's really one of ours, who's going to chair tonight's event. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Peter. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. I'll echo my welcome. Thank you very much. Gosh, what a packed house. I hope everyone's got a beer. I know I have. Had. What a fabulous venue to be able to do that for a start. A cinema where you can get a beer. That's a good start. That has to be part of the Rewilding programme, I'm sure. This evening, as you know, because you're here, we are going to be hearing about and discussing the potential of rewilding in Britain and beyond, and whether or not that's a desirable thing for us to do. In fact, we're going to be hearing what rewilding means. What's the point in the first place from our distinguished panel to my left here, who very shortly will be introducing themselves. But before they do that, I'd like to add a little context to the crisis, and believe me, it is a crisis that we find ourselves in. As it happens, and this is a coincidence and a rather handy one, I've been living in the UK for about 50 years. I moved here, I was born in East Africa, in Kenya, and I came to Bristol when I was 3 years old, and Somerset since I was 16 or 17 years old. And over that time, it's a particularly important time, 50 years, it's not very long in the scheme of things, well, I like to think so, we've suffered a catastrophic decline in wildlife across this nation. The recent State of Nature report did a stocktake of over 3,000 species in the UK, and they found that 60% of those species were in decline, of which over 30% were in serious decline, 10% threatened with extinction. We're waving our fingers at places like India, talking about tigers, we're waving our fingers in Africa, talking about rhino, and here on our doorstep we're wiping out species. Now, many of you in the room tonight will have felt and noticed some of those changes, where there were lapwings commonly nesting in the fields around here, there are none. Where 20, 30 years ago you could go out and you could easily pick up 60 skylarks singing as you walked around this area. Now if you pick up 2 or 3 of their sweet voices from the sky, you're doing well. It's a lucky day. And the list goes on. So the question is, are these losses a necessary evil? Is that something that you have to do? Does it make way for what we need, and is that way the way it should be? And what difference does it make anyway if we lose them? Obviously I'm biased. Well, we know now, as many people have always known, that our very existence depends on a healthy natural system. The soil in which our food grows, the water we drink, the air we breathe, all fundamentally linked to healthy natural ecosystems, all of which are hugely impoverished by the way we've used and abused the land. And as we near the breaking point of these life support systems, and we're getting close, we need collectively to look at and embrace new ways of living, a paradigm shift. And rewilding may well play a fundamental role in that shift. Now, to discuss rewilding this evening, I have the great pleasure of introducing our panelists, each of whom, in fact, are going to introduce themselves, saves me a job, and why they're here, just very briefly, starting with George Monbiot.
Thanks, Helen. Well, I realised about 5 years ago 3 things which all hit me with tremendous force at about the same time. The first was that I was ecologically bored. As a young man, back when woolly mammoths roamed the earth, I spent a lot of my time in really fantastic habitats, doing really exciting things. And now I was living back in Britain, and I realised there was almost no such place in Britain where I could just lose myself, get away from the intensive human impacts of farming, fishing industry, whatever it might be, and immerse myself in the wild nature that I love so much. The second thing was a recognition which was closely allied to that one, was that we live in a fantastically depleted nation, a nation whose depletion has become so much a fact of our lives that we hardly notice it anymore. But just to give you one figure I'll give you two figures as an example of the state of this place. While the average forest cover in the European Union is 37%, ours is 12%. While we have 48,000 square kilometres of water within our fishing limit, our 12-mile fishery limit in the UK, 5 square kilometres of that, 0.01%, is no-take zone. In other words, where the commercial fishing industry can't go. So these 3 tiny pocket handkerchiefs of sea, which are not routinely wrecked by trawlers and dredgers and all the other aspects of the fishing industry. And the third realization I had was that I had just spent 25 years telling people, follow us, environmentalists, and the world might be slightly less crap than it would otherwise have been. And realizing that wasn't actually a very inspiring message. And the 3 things came together for me in realizing, first, that we need a positive environmentalism. Now, those of you who are involved in the transition movement will already be well aware of what one aspect of a positive environmentalism, a propositional, a proactive environmentalism can look like, rather than an environmentalism which only responds to the bad stuff and tries to stop it. Of course, we've also got to do that, but we desperately need to provide a vision of a better world rather than just of a slightly less bad one than we already possess, or than that we are likely to possess, unless something shifts. But we need more than just transition towns, marvellous as that is, more than the many other positive aspects which I know a lot of you in Froome are already embedded in. We need to extend that into as many fields of environmentalism as possible. And I saw conservation in this country being really locked in to a very boring, very conservative approach to the land and the sea. And I thought that needs to be shifted to a much more visionary, exciting and positive one. So Rewilding brought those 3 aspects together for me, and I thought that's what I want to devote a lot of the remainder of my life to.
Great. Thank you very much.
Paul, thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you. And George, you've taken 1 minute of my time, which is great. I'll keep it very short and sweet. My name is Paul Lister. I do a couple of things. One is run a foundation called the European Nature Trust, and the other is own some land up in Scotland called the Aldo Wilderness Reserve. In Romania, sorry, I should say that the European Nature Trust focuses on environmental restoration in the Scottish Highlands and also protection of old growth forests in Europe. And the other passion of mine to do with the European Nature Trust is Romania, being the last real corner of Europe where there's vast forests. Something like 50% of all the old original forests left are in Romania. So there are 2 legacies I would like to leave behind in my lifetime. One is being part of a group of people, a movement to try and save that last great forest of Europe from destruction, like much of the rest of Europe has already happened. And the other is to see landscape restoration of the Scottish Highlands in the form of wolves and bears back inside a very large enclosure, like a South African style reserve, creating a better environment and for not only for people regarding occupations and so on, but also for the environment and giving a deer a proper predator rather than using a rifle with stalking. So that's that vision of mine has created a bit of controversy over the last 10 or so years, and I think now, thank you to the people along here and George particularly in writing his book, has sort of pushed that debate further forward. And I think it's about time now that we go on with that project and prove that there's another way of running a very sort of denuded landscape in the Scottish Highlands and upland area that could be put to better use and also be the benefit to all of us for clean water and healthy soils and better air. And that's it.
Hi, I'm Charlie Burrell. West Sussex is where I come from. I'm one of the practitioners of rewilding, I We have 3,500 acres of clay land in the lowlands of Britain. We have introduced 4 different drivers of the system. We now have Tamworth pigs running around this area. We've got fallow deer, red deer, cattle and ponies. And in the 15 years we've been running this, we've now got to a stage when we have 2% of the UK population nightingales. We have the biggest population of turtle doves in our region, more turtle doves than on the 250,000 hectares of land of the National Trust. We have purple emperors flying everywhere, so we've got the biggest population of purple emperor butterflies. What rewilding seems to give us is these unknown properties, these expansions of hope of these species that we don't really know enough about, and suddenly you get the feeling that we really don't know very much at all when you allow self-willed, free-willed land. So that's the net project. I think I can pass on. But
good evening, everyone. My name's Steve Carver. I'm the director of the Wildland Research Institute at the University of Leeds, which is a rather grand title for just a group of academics who are really interested in aspects of the wilder end of the landscape continuum, wilderness and wild land. As a geographer, I'm really interested in the spatial configuration of wildlands and wilderness and how we can define that, but also where we can fit that into our increasingly urbanised and industrialised landscape, and I include farming within that, although the gentleman to the left of me will say something a little bit different in a minute. But really what makes me tick about wilderness and rewilding and wild places is that although I've been fortunate enough to travel to some really wild places of the world, Siberia and Greenland and Alaska and places like that, when I come back here, back into the UK, I no longer have that frisson, if you like, of knowledge that I'm no longer top of the food chain. You go to Alaska, there's grizzly bears there. You go to Greenland, and there's the polar bear. And I miss that in our landscapes. The fact that everything is managed and in control, and nature is, how we want it to be in a way. I'd like to see some places back in the UK, like George, and I'm sure like Paul and like Charlie, and hopefully these gentlemen to the left of me, where we aren't in control anymore, where nature defines what happens. It may surprise us, it might not necessarily be what we expect, but I think in terms of rewilding, that's what I would like to see, wherever possible.
Thank you. My name is Colin Tudge. I like to say I'm a biologist by education and a writer by trade. And about 40 years ago, I started becoming obsessed with agriculture, and I'm also fairly obsessed by conservation. And of course, the two belong absolutely together. And the point about agriculture is it isn't just a question of producing food. It sits right at the heart of all the world's affairs, not just right at the heart of human affairs, but whether or not our fellow creatures survive depends almost absolutely on how we choose to farm. And yet, if you look at farming policy worldwide, certainly if you look at it in this country, wildlife basically doesn't enter into it. Traditionally, there's been and still is a kind of antagonism between conservationists or people interested in conservation and commercial farmers, just as there still is between commercial farmers and foresters. And in both cases, one says this is nonsense. The two things have to be working together. Did I say that about 5 years ago, 10 years ago, I coined the expression enlightened agriculture, also known as real farming, hence our group, the College for Real Farming. And the point that is defined as agriculture that is expressly designed to provide everybody in the world with good food, or food of the highest standards, without wrecking the rest of the world. Now the good news is that that is eminently possible. The world already produces enough food for 14 billion people, which is twice the present world population. That is also 40% more than we will ever need, because the UN tells us the population is going to level out at about 10 billion. At the moment, there is still a tremendous emphasis on production, and absolutely not is it justified in sociological terms, social terms, or in biological terms. It's purely about commerce. So the good news is that we could easily feed ourselves well, that there is lots of more leeway than we allow ourselves to believe. So there is lots of scope for saying, let's look after the wildlife as well as looking after ourselves. So plenty of leeway. The bad news is that the government doesn't look at it that way at all. And the government is, of course, basically these days just a sort of extension of the corporates. It just does whatever makes the most money in the shortest time. And all government policies seem they are aimed specifically at productivity and specifically at short-term profit, and not thinking at all about the wider picture. Just to finish up, what I want to say is that if George says we need a wider vision. Well, what I'm talking about is what I call agrarian renaissance. We need to rethink agriculture from first principles. To do that, we need to rethink everything else from first principles as well, including the nature of the economy, including our morality, including the nature of the science, including our attitude to nature, which is basically a metaphysical issue. We have to go right across the board. But the other thing is that we have to do it. This renaissance has to be led by people at large. The transition movement, I think, is sort of part of that. But what I'm now looking for, and this is the vision, is a people-led renaissance, which is fundamentally an agrarian renaissance. We have to take matters into our own hands. The good news, again, is there are actually lots of ways of doing that, which we can't discuss, I can't discuss, because I've got to come to an end right now, but they're all out there. Thank you.
My name is Edward Darling, and I'd like to firstly admire Steve for his passion and incitement in the countryside, but I'd like to make it quite clear I don't need the excitement in my life to feel that I'm going to get eaten at any stage. But apart from that, I'm here because I grew up with the joy. We had the trials work that set out to recreate some of the grasslands under intensive management regimes, unlike Miriam Rothschild's work that she'd allowed nature to take 50 years to work towards it. And on the back of the work that we hosted, the guy wrote the protocol for the Highways Agency, which is why we've got flowers all the way along the roadsides. Not always the right flowers, not always the right species, but Ed and Latham's most of the journeys make them a lot better than most of us can remember the ryegrass thatch that was there beforehand. I'm lucky enough to look after 500 acres of chalk downland, and I was aware that when I first came to the farm, there was more of interest in that little 2-acre patch, joy there, than there was in the rest of it. I've spent 25 years trying to restore wildlife. It's given me complete joy and pleasure of it, and the main problem was that it cost quite a lot, and my wife gave me a lot of grief about why I was doing this, and from that we've been involved with the creation of Red List Revival, and that gave a measurement system so that everybody could engage and understand just what they're contributing. So it's not just these vast open areas, but it's a way that brings every individual an opportunity to contribute. So that's what I'm hoping to bring this evening.
Thank you very much. Ladies and gentlemen, we shall shortly be playing a few films. Before I do, I'm just going to have a tiny little footnote to why the heck I'm up here, quite apart from trying to facilitate this evening. As a local to Frome, and Peter, I'm rather offended. You said I'm outside Frome. I regard myself as within the boundaries of Frome. By some people's standards, a great big pile, by many others, a tiny patch of 10 acres just down the hill. And 4 years ago, moved in to this area. We've lived in the area a long time, but moved into that patch. And we have been conducting a land restoration program on those 10 acres, and have seen the phenomenal uptake of biodiversity and biomass within that patch by actively changing the habitat profile. Absolutely with very little productivity for humanity, although I have to say we do have a vegetable garden that feeds the three of us more than enough, and in fact we have to give away very large beetroots on a regular basis. So it can be done, and we run a charity, the Simon King Wildlife Project, that's why that's stuck up on there, which not only advocates further land restoration, but we use live cameras which you can tap into at any point watching the wildlife on our home patch, and we intend to run this out across schools using education programs for primary schools in the first instance. So that's another reason why I'm sitting up here. Now, ladies and gentlemen, as I mentioned, we do have 3 short films which will give you further context and subtext to the rewilding proposition in general, and also two projects very specifically, Allerdale and NEP. I hope you enjoy. Thank you very much.
What does a wolf's howl mean to you? Does it make you excited, or perhaps wary? What does a wolf's howl mean to you? Does it make you excited, or perhaps wary? Go back just 10 generations and your ancestors may well have been living alongside wolves. Back 55 generations and they perhaps knew the elusive and mysterious lynx.
The lynx is a beautiful, largely solitary ambush hunter. They present no real danger to humans, and in Scotland would be of little threat to livestock. There is plenty of habitat and wild prey for them, and the lynx could help to control roe deer populations. They would also disperse deer and so help prevent overgrazing of forests. What could be our objections? There are many who do not support wolf or bear reintroduction, but who do believe that the lynx would be a much easier and less challenging animal to live alongside. The reality is that these predators are shy, and most people walking through their territories would never see them. Just imagine how it would feel to walk amongst hills and forests, knowing that these charismatic animals were there, to be in the presence of such powerful and beautiful creatures, safe in the knowledge that they are more likely to run away than come anywhere near us. Is there anywhere that could support lynx? Although Britain is a crowded island, the Scottish Highlands is one of the wildest and least populated areas of Europe.
Mainly wiped out around 260 years ago. It suffered hugely from the unfounded superstitions that built up around it. But in reality, this is a shy and intelligent animal, and its sinister fairy tale image is undeserved. We now know that the threat to humans from wolves is minuscule. In the past 50 years, there have only been 17 fatal attacks on humans in the whole of Europe, Russia and North America. Domestic dogs and even horses are statistically far more dangerous to humans. We can't avoid risk, but we humans are fickle and often like to choose some risks over others. We also know that there is enough prey and habitat for wolves, at least in Scotland. There is real concern that they might prey on sheep and dogs, but we can learn lessons from other countries that live alongside these animals. Techniques for protecting livestock and dogs, as well as compensation schemes for their loss, have been used in other parts of Europe and the United States. Would Britons be willing to adopt such schemes? Could we make them work here? If so, we could reap the benefits of wolf tourism, as is now the case in the United States of America. In Yellowstone National Park, where wolves have been reintroduced, Thousands of visitors come every year for the opportunity to hear wolves howling, and if they're lucky, to catch a glimpse of these shy and elusive animals. But perhaps the wolf's absence for 260 years in Britain has been too long. Of all our missing predators, the bear is the one that presents the biggest challenge. At present, we do not have enough habitat for bears, but perhaps our descendants may one day consider its return. The bear is the only top predator that could pose any significant threat to human safety. Would future generations be prepared to learn ways of avoiding conflict, knowledge that is taken for granted in parts of Europe and the United States? Only time will tell. With limited resources available for conservation, some suggest it is best to channel money into protecting existing species. But there is strong evidence to suggest that the return of predators could help restore balance to the countryside. The high deer numbers in Scotland have a devastating effect on woodland and other habitats. Predators could help to manage this problem, allowing wild forests to regenerate. And the reality is that even some of the wilder parts of England and Wales have habitats suitable for the lynx. The EU Habitats Directive requires member states to investigate the feasibility of reintroducing certain missing species that have been wiped out by humans. This doesn't mean we have to actually reintroduce them, simply to investigate the possibility. We may have strong views for or against reintroductions, but we can never be sure our views are correct if not backed up by a scientific trial. Is it fair to ask people in other countries to live alongside and protect tigers, for example, if we refuse to live with top predators ourselves? Would we have a bit more credibility if we did share our island with wolves or lynx? To consider bringing back our missing predators is controversial, and however we feel about our ancestors' decision to remove them from wild Britain, it is we modern Britons who will make the choice whether or not they return. And the inescapable truth is, our ancestors acted out of ignorance and fear when they removed the top predators from our landscapes. But we are much better informed, and just imagine the respect with which our descendants will regard us if our legacy to them is the restoration of our wild places, complete with the lynx, the wolf, and perhaps even the bear. Just imagine.
The great wood of Caledon that once existed throughout Scotland has been lost through the Industrial Revolution, 2 world wars, fighting the Spanish and the Armada, and now we've got 1% left. And that's really what's driven me and motivated me to do what I'm doing. My sole objective is to create a controlled fenced reserve of a minimum of 50,000 acres where we can restore large carnivores back into the area to manage the deer numbers and become an alternative to a traditional sporting estate.
I was hired to reintroduce wolves to Yellowstone National Park, in essence restore their ecological function to the park. There was a lot of fear, it was the unknown, and what people knew is they killed them off. And why'd they kill them off? Because they were a problem. What'd they do? Well, they killed livestock and they competed with us for elk and deer, and we like to be the primary carnivore people. And so wolves are just kind of a nuisance, they're in the way. So we got rid of them. You get calls at all times of the day. You get calls every day of the week. Sometimes they call just to harass. You can't lose it yourself. You've got to maintain control. Have I been threatened? Yes, many times. Outrage in the press because things, you know, it seems like nobody's ever happy. And I am squarely in the middle. Really, it wasn't that hard biologically. It was really hard sociologically. But coincident with these carnivore increases, you get this kind of response that benefits a whole wide circle of animal. I don't know if you can hear it because of the stream, but I'm listening to 3-4 different species of songbirds. And these songbirds have increased as this willow's increased. Elk changed Yellowstone. Wolves are slowly, they haven't done this yet, changing it back. Wolves bring the wild right back in front of you. They have a certain aura and presence about them that we just don't get in everyday life. That's had a huge economic impact for wildlife tourism in the Yellowstone area. $35 million per year to communities that are next to Yellowstone. It's some of the best time in Yellowstone's history, actually.
Well, we just really celebrated 10 years now at Aldo, and we've really focused very much on the landscape restoration in regards to reforestation. Planted something in excess of 800,000 trees, many different species. We've restored our peatlands, but on top of that, we've now brought back red squirrels to an area of Scotland that haven't been seen for decades. It's not common knowledge that just 3% of global philanthropy goes to the environment, which is basically air, water, and soil. 3 vital things on which we depend. Unless we see that imbalance adjusted, we're heading for a brick wall. I think it's about time that we worked out that we share this planet with other species. We can't survive here alone.
The Western Ada runs through the Knepp Estate in West Sussex. This is now at the heart of the largest rewilding project in lowland England. It's based on a naturalistic organic grazing system using free-roaming ponies, cattle, pigs and deer. Much of the river was canalised in the 19th century. The challenge was to return the river to its floodplain, allowing dynamic natural processes to return. The Ada is created from surface water, which means that here, in the upper reaches, it can slow to a trickle in the summer, but in winter, with saturated clay soils and heavy rainfall, it can swell to huge volumes. Draining the land for agriculture has increased the speed that the water runs off the land. Our aim has been to reverse this process, slowing the water down and allowing it to stay on the land for longer, as it used to, and to create a myriad of water habitats.
We began by simply filling in the old canals just behind me and returning the river to its old meanders, which you could see across the floodplain. And there we created channels for both summer and winter flow. A gang of volunteers put in woody debris blockages to create complexity and new sediment pathways. This has created a range of new aquatic habitats like eddies and pools and riffles, as well as submerged and exposed sediment bars. It's been an incredibly dry spring with very little rainfall, but normally these woody debris blockages trap sediment and twigs and other organic matter, and this allows oxygenation, which in turn improves the water quality. In effect, we've been behaving exactly like beavers. We've created 25 hectares of scrapes. Some of them hold water all year round, others dry up entirely in the summer. And this has created a range of important habitats for aquatic plants, invertebrates, and for wintering and breeding birds.
Our grazing animals also interact with these watery habitats, puddling, grazing, softening the margins, providing pools of warm, shallow water for invertebrates. Sometimes they surprise us with their ingenuity. Our pigs love diving for swan mussels and are often seen behaving like hippos.
Where the footpath crossed the floodplain, we created this causeway, and nearby a couple of tree platforms, which are now fantastic vantage points for viewing wildlife.
We also took out 4 weirs and modified another to allow easier passage for fish. In the first month, we counted 6 sea trout running over the Hammer Pond spillway. But this isn't a project in isolation. It's part of a much larger holistic view of hydrology. We've also filled in ditches and broken drainage systems and created scrapes and restored water systems throughout the entire rewilding project. We're interested in the entire water cycle, from the moment it falls as raindrops on the land, filtering through vegetation, through the soil, passing into brooks and streams, and finally into the Ada itself as it heads towards the sea.
Thank you very much. Well, hopefully that's given you some idea, or a greater idea of what we're talking about. But of course, the best way to get a full picture of rewilding is from the panellists to my left. And so there will be an opportunity a little later for you to put your questions to the panel. But first I'm going to launch with a few questions that very specifically target some ideas that I hope we all share, some thoughts and questions in our minds. Starting with you, George, if I may, and then going down the line. And if I may, thank you, better get a microphone, or else it's going to be a bit embarrassing and a bit too intimate if you come and try and share this one. What, from your point of view, is rewilding over and above the introduction of wolves, or is it that? Just give us your take, the context of what it means.
I see it primarily as being the mass restoration of ecosystems. I see it.
There we go. Maybe we will just do a duet on this.
In the first instance, I see it as being the mass restoration of ecosystems, which of course are not just terrestrial ones, but also freshwater ones and marine ecosystems as well. And in a country like Britain, above all that means on land, getting some trees back in the hills, restoring the watersheds, restoring the places where you would expect wildlife to live, but we have this real peculiarity in Britain that while our lowlands are mostly bare, which is what you'd expect because that's where the good agricultural land is, our uplands, where the land is generally very poor for agriculture, very low grade indeed, are even barer as a result of a subsidy-driven and subsidy-dependent sheep industry in England and Wales, combined in Scotland with grouse and deer shooting, which have just denuded the very places where you would expect to find wildlife in abundance. But it also can mean, as we saw in that wonderful example from NEP, the rewilding of rivers, which is absolutely crucial, and in the lowlands I see as being the main rewilding initiative to be done in Britain. I would love to see buffer zones around all our rivers, which will help to prevent flooding, which provide continuous habitat corridors for a wide range of species, which provide that crucial liminal zone between land and water which so many species occupy. And at sea, some large areas, around 30% I'd love to see, of the seas around our coasts shut off to commercial fishing and other forms of commercial extraction. And we see a great resurgence of life of all kinds. But also, as another crucial part of the rewilding rewilding vision, wherever possible, to see keystone species brought back. And keystone species are ecological engineers, species which have ecological impacts greater than their numbers and their biomass alone would suggest. Species like beavers, like boar, like wolves, like lynx, which drive the creation of niches for a whole lot of other species. And at sea, that involves large sharks, it involves whales, all the species we used to have in abundance around our coasts, but have now largely gone. And those two things, the mass restoration and the keystone species, enable us, once those are in place, as much as possible, to step back and let nature do its thing. So that's the third element of rewilding for me, as little human intervention as we can get away from it.
Thank you. Paul?
Thank you. Rewilding. Well, I'll give you a short story. When I was in my early 20s, I went up to Scotland and I started deer stalking. And when you pull the trigger on a big animal, you kind of think, what's this all about? Why am I doing it? What's the purpose? And over the next few years, I began to learn what happened to the demise of the great wood of Caledon up in the Highlands. And a friend of mine, Roy Dennis, who many of you might know, suggested that I went across to Romania to meet a gentleman called Christoph Promberger, who was then working for the Munich Wildlife Society in a large carnivore initiative for Europe. And having been to Romania and seen what was over there and seeing its wonderful forests and landscapes, it kind of thought to me how sad it was to be living in a country where literally 1% of the original forest is still left. So at the right time in my life, I thought it was about some 15 years ago, a few things happened and I had a bit of an epiphany, and I decided that rather than staying in business or industry, I would get involved with a rewilding project up in the Scottish Highlands. So for me, the rewilding that we're involved with is to really try and vision an area of land way up in the Highlands, far away from big cities, and to give nature a chance. And for me, that would be to see, apart from planting the trees we've been planting and red squirrels that we've reintroduced and the thousands of school children we've had up to Aldo over the last 10 years, ultimately, for me, rewilding is to put back the natural predators who are there to take care of the huge population of red deer that we have. And I think that there's lots of talk about wolves and lynx coming back and being released. For me, I think the idea of a wolf running around the Scottish Highlands in the first instance without some kind of control would be impossible. So our vision of rewilding is to see an area of less than 1% of the Scottish Highlands put aside, and instead of having 300 or 400 people a year either walk through or come and visit Annandale, there'd be more like 20,000 coming over 365 days of the year, enjoying magnificent landscapes and also natural, more nature than there would have been before. And I think that wolves and bears are a huge draw for tourism, and I think in an area of Britain where employment is fairly difficult to come by, that I think that my thoughts on rewilding are natural predators taking care of the prey and modelling something that's happened in South Africa. I'd love to see that then spread, obviously, eventually, but let's just get on with one of these projects in the Scottish Highlands and see where it takes us. So it pretty much focused on Scotland for me.
Thank you very much. Charlie?
Another story. Pigs breed purple emperors. What I'm doing in the lowlands of Sussex is not the big wolves, it's not the lynx, it's the most populated part of Europe. We're squashed between London and Brighton. What do you do about rewilding those sort of areas? And we can do a lot, and the NET project tells us that. Pigs breed purple emperors. Without the pig, we wouldn't be the #1 spot in the UK for purple emperor butterflies. Why? These pigs don't really have much to do with butterflies and things, but actually what they do is they create the right environment for the food plant of the butterfly. And the butterfly needs, now we know, because it's no longer considered to be a woodland species, this particular butterfly is a sallow scrub species. So how do you get sallow scrub? You need to have the pig making changes in that environment, allowing that seed to fall, to germinate, and to start producing lots and lots of sallow scrub. Once you get that, you get the purple emperor butterflies. The things that we're learning at NEP are extraordinary. Every every year we come up with a new thing that's going on, things that are changing science around some of these species. We all think we know a lot about nature. You talk to a lot of people in my field, my work, and you get to feel, actually, we don't know anything about nature, and these are the scientists saying we don't know what's going on. And if we allow these self-willed bits of land, this bit of rewilding on lowland England, reconnecting whole landscapes, running down rivers, as George suggests, we then are going to get some of these emergent properties that we are missing at the moment. So I think for me, the rewilding isn't the links, because it's probably not going to happen between London and Brighton. Maybe Iberian links. Maybe we shouldn't be true to what was here before. Maybe we should have some other things that are more suited to our area. But anyway, it's probably going to be a tough call on the links. Beaver, yes, why not? Anyway, I think I better pass on.
Thank you, Steve.
Couple of things, no stories, but a couple of things. One is that rewilding as a term sometimes gets confused. The in rewilding often implies to many people going back to something that we had before. And of course, climate change and land use change and people's attitudes have changed over the millennia, which means we can't go back to something that we had before. We've got to go forward. So quite often I like the idea of wilding, just wilding, or future nature, or future natural, phrases which you may have heard. But the in rewilding is also important in the context of allowing wild back into our lives, so rewilding in that context and back into our landscapes. So it's not about going back, it is about looking forward into the future. I'd probably take issue with some of the things that maybe Paul said about wolves in the Scottish Highlands, and maybe what Charlie said about lynx in southern Britain, in that the only thing that's stopping these animals from arriving here is the English Channel and our attitudes. There are wolves making forays from Eastern Europe through Germany and into the Netherlands and into Denmark, and these are very, very densely populated countries whose landscapes are dominated by industry and urban and agriculture. And yet wolves are making forays into those landscapes. They're looking for new territories. So if it wasn't for the English Channel, they'd be rocking up on your estate, Charlie, and I don't know what you feel about that. We've actually done some analysis at Leeds University, albeit briefly, which indicates that actually there is enough forest cover probably for some lynx in the Weald, places like that. There's pretty dense population, dense wooded landscapes there. I think the only thing that's really stopping those animals from coming back to Britain is our attitude, our sort of mindset. There's a bit of a blockage somewhere in some people that says that, oh, we got rid of these animals a long time ago. Why should we bring them back? We need to change people's attitudes to allow them to come back and live safely in our landscapes. I've been in Berlin and places like that, and there are wolves near Berlin, living in old USSR training grounds. We've got Salisbury Plain, maybe wolves could be in Salisbury Plain, I don't know. Maybe it needs a bit of research, but I think attitude is the main barrier, as well as the English Channel, which is a geographical one. And in some respects, I wish we didn't have the English Channel. We might all be speaking German now, but who knows? But we would have wolves making a comeback, and maybe lynx with that.
Thank you. Colin, how in the context of what we're discussing, this is all very well, and it sounds utopic to some. We all eat, we all need a resource, we all here have to feed ourselves. How does rewilding work in the context of feeding a nation?
If you look at sort of present day agricultural policy strategy, insofar as I understand it, of the British government, good place to start. They talk about this thing called, sustainable intensification. And what they mean by that actually is sounds good, because they're very good at plucking phrases that mean nothing out of the air. And that one means business as usual, whack on the pesticide, whack on the fertilizer, etc., and then leave a margin around the outside where you grow plants. Now, they also talk about being evidence-led. We are scientists, we're all these scientists working for us. where is the evidence that actually works? There's a hell of a lot of evidence that suggests it doesn't work, but they don't actually. It's all to do with mindset, doctrine, all that stuff.
Could you bring the mic a little closer to your mouth, please? Just
Sorry?
a little. That's it.
Oh, yes, sorry.
Thank you.
Where was I up to? In fact, what we should be thinking about is not just what happens around the margins of the fields, but what happens in the middle of the fields. And you should be asking yourself, can you grow crops or raise livestock in the company of appreciable numbers of wild creatures, and the more the merrier? And the answer is yes, of course you can. And for example, there are some very specific agricultural methods that are very, very wildlife friendly and are also known to be really very, very productive in terms of the total amount of food you get per hectare. Very productive. I mean, I can't go into that, but they work. They include things like agroforestry, where you combine growing significant numbers of trees with crops, and you find, for example, arable crops even benefit from the presence of trees. They actually, to some extent, like the shade, and you get very, very high yields if you do it properly. There is the whole movement of pasture-fed livestock. You don't need to feed cattle and sheep. We can argue about sheep later with George, but you don't need to feed cattle on imported soya and loads and loads of homegrown cereal. A certain amount, perhaps, but basically we should be looking at how you grow pasture, and it shouldn't be monocultural pasture. Herbicide, thingamajig, ryegrass. It should be nice mixed, etc., swards. And again, very productive. And it was mentioned in one of the films, the use of ponds and such like things to slow up the water. It's kind of productive because it can improves the land in general, but it's also very, very wildlife friendly. So there's a whole number of things that can be done that are, well, very wildlife friendly and productive. On the matter of reintroduction, I mean, there's lots one could say, but just to be brief, I was very impressed with those films that they focused on the wolf, the lynx, and the bear. Now that looks like an indulgence, it looks like Longleat, or it may even look like Jurassic Park, introducing these big beasties to look out for fun, etc. Actually, it's much more than that, as several people mentioned, really. There's been a paradigm shift, cliche term, but it's very applicable, in ecological thinking over the last 30 years. And it used to be assumed, because it seems to be obvious, that the ecology is led by the plants, because, they grow first. And then along come the herbivores, and the herbivores that come along are the ones that like those particular plants. And then the predators come along as sort of spivs and parasites who sort of pick off the herbivores that happen to be there. It's now clear that it's entirely the other way around. And it's the herbivores that drive the vegetation. They, in fact, determine what grows. And how the herbivores behave crucially affects how the plants grow, and how the herbivores behave is very much determined by what predators are there and cause them to form herds or to reduce their numbers or whatever they do, and in fact to stay away from the river banks because they get snaffled and so on and so on. So you see that the restoration of these wild beasties, I mean these big beasties, is not a game. It actually is crucial to restoring the ecosystem, and to restore the ecosystem, as everybody stressed, is absolutely vital.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Edward. You work the land in a rather different way.
Well, the work, I was kind of going back to your earlier point, I see rewilding as just one of the tools in a completely depleted toolbox at the moment. We need to put as many of the different sources back into the mechanism so we can revive wildlife in various ways, and this is a very important tool and probably it's a star attraction. But going back to your comment about wildlife losses, we've got completely numb to some of the statistics, the fact that we've lost over 90% of the populations of some of the species. We produced our own bar charts. This is the number of grey partridges, corn buntings, yellow wagtails and turtle doves that have been left after the last 40 years of our management. When you start putting it in terms like that, it only takes one gulp from Colin and the whole lot's gone. But this is how tangibly close we are to losing these species. So anything... Sorry, that's 96% gone, so we're getting close. But this is imperative. So any of the tools that raise the awareness, that get people to engage, and then from these grand schemes at the very top, right the way down to individual contributions that we can make, become very important. My own particular interest is looking at these as the rewilding parts as part of a larger scheme, whether it's on a 10-kilometre grid square or larger areas in the more expansive areas. But if we can start looking at those, we're creating the equivalent of green hearts that can draw life in and sustain it at critical times, and then pump life back into the surrounding areas, so that all the works that everybody starts to contribute to starts making a difference. But we really need these acolyte sites to lead and inspire.
Thank you. Another question, Steve, if I may keep the microphone, please, because we've talked about Scotland, we've talked about NEP. Do you think, and you've got an overview of the British Isles as a whole, that rewilding can play a role in every county in the United Kingdom? Do you think it has a real place in every county in the UK?
Well, absolutely. I mean, at its micro level, you can rewild your garden by not gardening. You know, you can just not garden. You know, you can do it at that level. So a lot of my work as a geographer is focused on these varying geographical scales, and people have mapped this thing what we call the wilderness continuum. It's an environmental modification spectrum based on the degree of human influence in the land. At global scales, you know, there are global maps of wilderness, wilderness quality. There are European maps. You know, I've been working with colleagues in Europe, in Altair and in Pan Parks, and colleagues at Leeds, mapping wilderness quality in Europe. We have maps, formal maps for Scotland, and we've been working on a map for Wales. And these maps tell us where the wild places are based on the degree of human influence. And that will be from agriculture and from industry, it'll be from transportation and from population, and from the visual impacts and how remote those places are. So we can use those maps to inform where are potentially good places to rewild. So we can ask questions like, where are all the places which have all of the qualities of wildness, but in some way are slightly modified by human activity? Now that might be from sheep grazing, or it might be from artificial drainage, things that we can change and put back and allow nature to then start to determine the outcome within those particular landscapes. But the critical factor, Simon, is always going to be land ownership. You know, and this is one of the key things. We've got some really good people sat here with us in the context of Paul and Charlie and Ed. And they have land. And to do rewilding properly, I guess, you need to own land to determine what's happened to it. And so, you know, land ownership combined with some of these maps will help us target areas for rewilding. So yes, it can take place in any county, but some counties are probably going to be better than others for large landscape scale. But yeah, please go out and not garden. Grow your veg, but you know.
Charlie, how do you get that message out to your neighbours? How do you begin to transfer what it is that you've so admirably achieved at NEP to filter across the whole of southern England, Sussex, Surrey and on?
Quite interesting. What was it, last week? George was invited to talk to the Savills and Savills landowners dinner in London. And George gave he was a lot better than the Cumbrian sheep farmers. George gave a 45-minute talk to these landowners, and there was a lot of land in the room. But these landowners, you know, these are landowners, not farmers. So these are landowners. So they're looking at the picture from running a home farm, running a system, and working out actually they're not making any money on their home farm. They're losing money if you stripped away the subsidies. They really are losing money. So it's a sort of picture that actually was surprisingly sat rather well with them. I talked to a lot of them afterwards and moved around the room, and it was quite interesting, the questions that George was asked for 40 minutes after this 45-minute talk. One of the things that we're trying to think about is, you know, how do we connect NEP with our landscape, which means a lot of other landowners, and also big major roads. So we've got the A24, big dual carriageway that runs down the side of the estate. One of the ideas we've sort of talking about, and only talking stages, is actually reconnecting NEP with the sea. We're only as the river flows about 14 miles to the sea. And we're in obviously one of the most populated bits of Europe, so we've got Brighton, Hove, Worthing, Bognor, you name it, and there's not much gaps to the sea, but maybe there is a little, little clinks. So what about that? What about actually having the aspiration and the dream, and then trying to involve all those landowners from us to the sea? We need to build a land bridge over the A24 to get to the sea. That will be a £6 million project. It will then need to have all the uptake of all the people that are involved all the way down to the sea. But that is quite possible, I reckon, in my lifetime. So really quite exciting, I think.
Great. Paul, in the context of the Highlands, how does your echo resonate?
Well, I think over the last 12 years, and more recently, the last 4 or 5 years, there's been several other landowners who are making positive steps towards rewilding, whether it means reducing deer numbers to something like 1 or 2 or 3 per square kilometre from what was once probably 20 or 30, and allowing for some natural regeneration. There are neighbours of mine who are watching very closely what we were doing with our reforestation programme. I think we put in something like 700,000 native trees, saplings, and now our direct neighbours followed suit. So I kind of like to think there's a little bit of an osmosis process. There's a little bit of I kind of like, well, maybe he's not completely nuts, and maybe we should sort of follow what he's doing. I mean, when I first spoke about wolves and bears in a large-scale reserve, of course, that was a big change. I mean, for people to come from a traditional hunting, shooting, fishing background, and to then say, right, after 150 years of that being a sort of way of managing the landscape, now I want to do something very different. It's going to take some time. And I like to think that we're winning the battle. I think that there's more people that are now thinking that maybe we should actually be letting nature take its part and try and take some of the pressure off the land. And really the biggest problem we have is deer numbers. I mean, just nothing grows. Nothing out with a fence will grow. So we've reduced our deer down from something like 20 since I arrived to, I think, 6 or 7 per square kilometre. I'd still like to go further, but we have a deer stalking industry as well. So a third of our revenues come from that at the moment, but we hope that will sort of be out-surpassed by nature watchers and people who want to come and visit Aldo for other reasons. But I do think my neighbours are becoming a little bit more curious. I haven't recently gone round and spoken to them all, but I think in the next 12 months we're doing some work to try and put some flesh on the bones to our idea. And I think once that work's been done, I think we can then go and speak to people and talk to them, and I think we could probably excite them.
Thank you. George, we've talked about the end game to a certain extent, and the ambition and the vision. Where do you begin? How do you start? What's the catalyst that actually engages not just the people in the room who are engaged, but those who are going to be making decisions as well that profoundly affect the course of events as they present themselves?
Well, just in the last few months we've launched our group Rewilding Britain, one of whose aims is exactly to catalyse these kinds of changes, to try to help other people to start rewilding projects, to try to overcome some of the legal obstacles, the institutional obstacles, the political obstacles, and obviously there's a lot of work to be done. But what we're finding is that in places where you might have expected a great deal of resistance, like at the landowners' dinner the other night, in some of those places it's just not there, or it's much more muted than you would expect it to be, and there's actually quite a lot of active interest. Not everywhere. I talked to the Cumbria Federation of Commoners, the sheep farmers in the Lake District. Didn't go down quite so well. But it's surprising the way things are turning and the speed with which things are turning. And the groups, including some conservation NGOs, who were quite hostile just about 3 years ago, are now becoming much more receptive to the idea and are already beginning to do a little bit of rewilding to suddenly go further along the spectrum on their own land. And it has to be said that conservation in this country is in a pretty weird space, or it has been until recently at any rate, where very often we see conservation groups deploying exactly the methods that we deplore when we see them abroad. So, for instance, many of us have sent money to groups to try to prevent cutting and burning and grazing in the Amazon and try to prevent the rainforest from being turned into ranches. Well, in many of the reserves in Britain, especially in the uplands, cutting, burning and grazing are seen as essential conservation tools. Anywhere else on Earth, we would recognise those as forms of environmental destruction. And here, because we have this back-to-front conservation, where we start with the highly depleted ecosystems we have, and we try to lock them into place, we have somehow got ourselves into this weird mindset where we see those as being the saviours of nature rather than the destroyers of it. But that, I perceive already, is beginning to change.
I think you're right. I would venture, though, that what we also see in the conservation movement as it stands historically is human beings playing the roles that we're discussing here are amply and ably fulfilled by wild animals, beavers, deer, boar, all of which are doing the cutting and the slashing and the burning and the grazing to a certain extent. They don't do the burning. I retract the burning bit. Lightning does that from time to time, but very occasionally in Britain. May I pass the microphone to Colin?
Just picking up on George's response to your question, how you're going to change things and so on. I agree with him entirely. One of the things that struck me over the last 10 years of sort of campaigning and so on is that many, many people are already on side, including big landowners and people who live in cities and so on. So the question's often asked, how are you going to persuade people to do things differently? The real answer is I can't be bothered to persuade anybody. All I want to do first is to identify the people who are already on side, of whom there are legion. And it seems to me that if you did identify all the people who are on side already and you've got some sort of coherence between them, that we already have a critical mass of people that could change the world. There are two big obstacles, I think, to overcome. One is that people's heads have been filled, as 'twere by the powers that be, with all sorts of stuff which is simply untrue. And one of the things that is simply untrue is that we need 50% more food by 2050, which is John Bennington's thing. Another thing which is simply untrue is that this can only be achieved by high tech. Not so. The third thing that is simply untrue is that high tech can only be supplied by corporates who are, as it were, impelled by the neoliberal market. Free competition, not true. Once you realise all these things are just untrue, now whether they're lies or whether they're just, mistakes, I don't know. But they're untrue is the point. And the third point is that people, I think, at large don't realise their own power. And one other thing, just a little statistic I think is quite fun, is that although it's very hard for people, individuals, to buy land because it's £10,000 an acre or £25,000 a hectare, you can do a very simple piece of arithmetic which shows that it would be possible for the people of Britain to bring about a total community buyout of all Britain's farmland for less than £6,000 a head. Now that, you can't put your money in your back pocket and pull that up, but I mean, as a bank loan per head, that is a trivial amount. So, why don't we think in these big terms? Why don't we say, we have got to take it over?
Yeah. Sorry, can I just, could George add something to that? Very briefly, thank you.
I would just say that we have already bought, paid for, all of Britain's farmland several times over through farm subsidies. And we have this extraordinary situation where we're spending over £3 billion a year on farm subsidies. And what are they delivering? I mean, if you're going to subsidise something, surely it should be delivering social and environmental goods. And what we're seeing again and again is social and environmental harm being delivered. At the moment, the primary form of farm subsidies is a basic payment scheme, which means that you are paid per hectare of land just for owning that land. So, all taxpayers, everyone in here who pays tax of any kind at all, is subsidising the richest people on earth. I mean, there are Russian oligarchs, there are oil sheikhs in this country who are being paid millions of pounds. They don't pay tax in this country. Some of them never even set foot here. They're the world's most successful benefit tourists. And we're pouring money into their pockets for what? So they can lay down more pheasants. So they can afford their private jet this year, whatever it might be. In the uplands, it's only because of farm subsidies that the hills are being scoured at all. There'll be no hill farming at all in this country, which is a totally unproductive use of the land. It just would not be there if we weren't paying for it. And what we're doing, we're destroying our watersheds, we're preventing any trees from re-establishing, we're wrecking the wildlife of those places, and it's not even sustaining communities because it's basically dead land use. It's just not working. The people on the land are getting older and older, the young people are leaving, the communities are falling apart. Income and employment is bleeding despite the money we're pouring into it. Now, I think we have bought this land, and we should be able to have far more of a say over how that land is used. Thank you.
We've heard that we've got to start somewhere. How do we begin to implement these changes? What does it take to start, from your point of view?
I was just a bit worried I'd been past the microphone at the end of the last question.
Oh no, you're welcome to answer that.
Well, no, my immediate response was I can understand why George didn't get on terribly well with the Cumbrian sheep farmers. But what we do need to know, alongside any of these persuasions or views, is we really need to identify what is producing wildlife at the highest levels and how we can build on those successes and replicate it as efficiently as possible. Because, yeah, the tax system and the payment systems are not delivering anything like what it ought to be doing. We've been spending close to £1 billion a year on conservation for the last 20 years, and that system's been witnessing an acceleration of the decline, so it's not working. So we need to find out what is working, build on those successes, and that's whether we're using these rewilding sites as sources for further repopulation. It is incredible how inspired people are, that you would naturally have been conditioned for years, as everybody's mentioned, they're in this mindset. But when you take them out of that mindset and show them something different, and the fact that that needs to be done differently, if we can provide them the same tools that have provided this huge increase in crop production over the last 40 years, if we can give them the same tools that will produce wildlife with the same level of efficiency and improvement, then we're going to make real progress and quickly, because the two things we don't have in great supply is time and money. So if we can do it better and quicker, then that would be great.
Thank you. Steve, can I ask Steve to contribute to that, please?
Yeah, implementation. It's a real difficult one for a lot of us. I mean, we need land, which we've always talked about. We need investment, which will come with the land, I guess. But then the policy changes, I think, are the key thing. The policy changes which will allow this to happen. Conservation always follows the money. You get a lot of well-meaning nature NGOs actually following what Georgia referred to as these perverse subsidies. They're putting grazing onto land which they would like to see develop naturally, but they're putting the grazing on the land because they get money for it from the government. So if we change the emphasis of some of those payments to environmental stewardship payments rather than from production payments, that might be one way forward. I think the other way forward is through Europe. I mean, it's Europe that's driving a lot of this for us. I've been various places across Europe, and I've got a little story here to chip in. I was in the Brandenburg reserves, and these were these ex-USSR military training areas, which have a very strong resemblance to Salisbury Plain. And there are wolves living in these training areas now. They were bought by the Brandenburg Foundation for €1 each. And I think there's about 3 of these areas. And they're about 50 kilometres south of Berlin. And, obviously they're governed by European nature regulations. They are SAC sites and SAP sites, SPA sites, sorry. And so they fall under European nature regulations, which therefore means they have to be managed under favourable conservation status, so the status for which they were designated. And I asked the German guy who was in charge of this, I said, how do you cope with this? Because you're managing this under non-intervention management. You're letting nature take its course, and it's changing. So it's no longer meeting the favourable conservation status rules. And he looked at me and he said, we shit on the law. I said, you're German, you can't say that. And he goes, well, actually what we do is we mow a buffer strip around the outside of these reserves. That's kept as heathland, the condition for which it was designated, because we mow it, and we use that as a as a buffer strip to stop wildfires moving into the adjacent farmland. And they return that as their favourable conservation status. So we've got to be a little bit, I guess, inventive. A little bit, yes.
Inventive. Very good one. Paul, do you think we need to be inventive?
I certainly do. I think we need to as the film said, we need to get wild again. And I think that in a very remote part of the British Isles, where population densities are incredibly at the bottom end of the scale as far as Europe's concerned, that we can afford to do that. But you know, my problem is that I'm not prepared to wait around another 40, 50 years for trees to grow and all that to come back. I mean, wolves need deer, they eat flesh, and I think that they'll do a sterling job of helping you know, the forest regenerate. I mean, there's a lot of seed source up there already. They just need a chance. I mean, I'd love to have some wild boar back as well, because that would break open the bracken and the heather and everything else, because they do a marvellous job. But you know, they need a bit of woodland to start with. But yeah, I think we just need to open our minds up, and in a part of Britain that's so sort of sparsely populated, there's a great opportunity, and maybe that can then be used as a model for other projects elsewhere. But unless we do something, you know, pretty soon, I'm sort of going to be very sad, because I'll end up passing away and not see it happen. And I'd very much like to see just an experiment, a trial, and it's only 50,000 acres. It's 1% of the Highlands of Scotland, as I said before, and I think that there's going to be something that's going to happen, and I'm looking forward to the next 5 years.
Great. Very soon I shall be opening questions to the floor. Just a few, because we are getting close to the wire. But before I do, I'd just like to rattle down the line and ask all of our panellists one question, specifically and briefly, if I may, who answers. Do you think that rewilding is here to stay? And I need probably not ask this, but should it be?
I think it's inevitable, and I think the question is whether we do it deliberately or whether it is foisted upon us. You know, we're going to see the end of farm subsidies. That becomes clear. It's crazy that in the age of austerity, when essential public services are being cut, the European Union is spending 55 billion euros a year on farm subsidies, on giving money to landowners. It's just completely bonkers. That is not a sustainable situation. And when the farm subsidies end, we're going to see a mass rewilding take place. Now, what I'm saying to farmers is, if you are wholly dependent on that, and we can draw a clear distinction here between the infertile uplands and the fertile lowlands, people in the fertile lowlands, on the whole, don't need subsidies. They'll just carry on doing what they do without it. In the uplands, there'll be no farming at all. And say, what are you going to do when they run out? And look, this could be an opportunity for you. There is money to be made here. There's all sorts of ways in which human communities can be regenerated, as well as wildlife communities. So rewilding could be one of your only options.
Thank you, Paul.
Yeah, I think I can only really speak in for the Highlands of Scotland, but I think if we can produce like green hubs or islands of goodness, I think that only spreads. I think if we can prove the case and say this is an alternative land use model, I think then we'll see some success. And I'm pretty sure that rewilding is going to attract a lot of interest, and a lot of people want to come and see it in process and everything else. And therefore other landowners will follow suit. And I'm already encouraged by, there's many others. Unfortunately, they're not my neighbours, but there are plenty more in Scottish Highlands who are very keen on seeing rewilding take place on their estates and so on. So yeah, I think it's here to stay.
Thank you, Charlie.
By 2030, there'll be 30 million hectares abandoned in Europe. 30 million hectares. That's the biggest opportunity we have, I think. What are we going to do with that 30 million hectares? Are we going to have a fully functioning system again? Are we going to have these big drivers going back into that landscape? Or are we going to let it just forest up? I think that's really going to be the big one.
Steve?
Well, I think yes and yes. I was, until actually this evening, pretty worried about the whole food security issue with growing global populations, this notion that we would have to be able to farm every inch of square land, you know, to get enough food to put on the table. I think it's the things that Colin said have kind of, you know, been encouraging in that respect. We can feed ourselves without doing that, and it's a matter of how we integrate the wild and the productive together, whether they're separate in separate envelopes across the landscape, or whether they're integrated or as kind of fuzzy continuum, is up to us, I guess, and up to opportunities that geography provides us with. But I think the answers are clearly yes and yes.
Thank you.
Absolutely. I mean, the cynical way of looking at rewilding, and there's always cynics around, is that it's a fashion that'll pass, you know, and all that kind of thing, like the hippies and so on. I just don't think that's true. I think there's been a real shift in what one might call the zeitgeist, and now most people out there are discontented with the way the world is and want a world with more wildlife in it. And that's a permanent thing, and it's going to keep on happening. Some way or other it's going to keep on happening. So it is, yes, a permanent shift.
Ed.
I'd just like to, a warning against the pressure on the private sector, but also the pressure on the public sector. Both departments have huge shortcomings. There are splendid examples in both. What we need to do is to embrace the best possible responses for today. And when I've been going around giving talks to communities such as this, and we say that there's the opportunity to build these 1 kilometre grid squares and blocks, building them up into the 10 kilometre grid squares and reversing these 20-year declines and building standards and enhancing populations. Everybody turns around and invariably turns and says, she'll do it. Now, the joy about coming to this audience is that there are 270 people sitting here that are likely to do it. So, yes, it's rewilding. There's vast stuff in the wilds and things, but it's also what you can make a difference with here.
Thank you very much. Ladies and gentlemen, is there a chance of having the lights of the house a wee bit higher so we can see who's asking questions? Because I should like to offer questions to the floor. Gentleman in the front. Makes it nice and easy to hand a microphone to you.
In your introduction, you talked about skylarks, and with maybe some words from Colin about farmland and so on. And I didn't hear much else apart from lots of very big projects. And one of the other comments was about land ownership, and this is maybe a question for Peter McFadian, who's here, who's representing the council. Councils own lots of land, as well as all of us own gardens, and I didn't hear really about how we can do rewilding in the garden, or beekeeper, and there's lots of things that happen there, but councils seem to be a missing element in access to rewilding.
Is Peter still with us? I'm sure he is.
Yeah, here.
Peter, right at the back, do you want to run down the front and grab a mic and address that? Because I know for a fact that certain things are happening and they're very positive. So
I think, absolutely, I think that's a really good point. And I was going to kind of argue, Steve is right that you need to have land, but there's no reason why communities can't have land. And if they don't have them and buy them, which has just happened in Frome, a group of the citizens of Frome have come together and bought a great chunk of land themselves. But they can also put pressure politically on councils to act in a way. So we as a town council, own land, but I don't see it like that. I see it as the people of Frome owning land, which the town council manages. So I think exactly that is happening. And so it's about electing the right people. I would say that, wouldn't I? And then working to get the right policy in place so that these things can happen. And that could happen far, far more, I would say.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Absolutely, just add that. I made the point at the beginning, it's a continuum of approaches, a continuum of landscapes, a continuum of scales. It's not a one-size-fits-all model. So, Paul's doing stuff, Charlie's doing stuff, but I was recently meeting where the big NGOs were getting together, the RSPB, the Wildlife Trust, the National Trust, the Woodlands Trust, were getting together and saying, hey, we've got all this land, how does it all map up together, and how can we work together, that's good for them, to integrate this into a larger landscape. But yeah, there's nothing wrong with not gardening your garden, but at the same time, what we've been saying there is really great stuff. So it's a continuum, I think.
Thank you. Gentleman in the middle row, that's going to be very challenging for a microphone. How good are you at catching, sir? It's coming your way.
Thanks, my name's Chris Smage. I'm a small-scale local farmer, and much as I agree with what George was saying about the subsidy regimen and Colin's points about the fact that it's not that difficult for us to farm in a way that is well integrated with the broader environmental purposes. I can speak from personal experience in saying it's not that easy to run a small, local, environmentally minded farm. And as George will know from our respective battles with the eco-modernists, there's this kind of siren song of get people out of the countryside, farm in this very intensive, high-tech, sort of arable-dominated way. So I just wonder if the panel have any thoughts on, if we're talking about lowland farming somewhere like Frome, what sort of ways can we combine your vision with supporting local small-scale farming?
Colin?
I just wanted to say that, I know Chris well and various other small farmers, and of course it's immensely difficult to make, well basically in this country it's immensely difficult to make a living by farming well. And if you want to make a fortune, kick over the traces of doing a like and throw on the herbicide and all the rest of it, and you can get very rich, largely for the reasons that George said. So I think for people that want to change the world, as it were, there are two tasks, and they're both immensely difficult, but the first is to make a living in the short term within the context of a hostile economy. And we all know there are various ways of doing that, with getting the local people on side and getting them to form a local market and forming a CSA and all those things. I know you've tried them all, they're all very, very hard. But that's the sort of way you have to scratch around so long as the economy is hostile. What we need to do is to, at the same time as people are trying to make a living in the short term, is lay the foundations for a different kind of economy that actually makes more sense. And the way forward for that actually is this series of mechanisms which are known as, collectively, as economic democracy, which includes things like conceiving every enterprise as a social enterprise, and the tripartite mixed economy, which means you have private ownership and government ownership, but you also, above all, have community ownership, which has been much underemphasized in this country. And then you have things like ethical investment, where people invest in, they invest in things that are good, basically, as opposed to things that aren't, and they know what they're investing in. And if you put these things together, these are perfectly conventional economic, mechanisms. None of them are radical in themselves, but they add up to something that could cause genuinely radical change. In the short term, that doesn't answer your question. You just have to sort of battle it out, as you are doing. But in the long term, that is what's necessary. But the point is that the mechanism is there, and the means of doing it are already in our hands. I find that encouraging.
Thank you, Colin. George, if you could add to that, please.
Well, thanks very much for your question, Chris. It's great to see you in the flesh. I've been reading quite a lot of Chris's stuff recently. I have to say he's one of the best writers in Britain, this guy. He's fantastic. Can I just say, if you want to make a living from farming, do more writing.
Write about it.
Not that that's particularly lucrative either, but I would say a couple of things. That there's been a big debate recently about, should we go for land sparing, in other words, the intensification in some places and leaving other places alone, or should we go for land sharing, which is what Colin's been talking about, permeable landscapes where farming and wildlife can live alongside each other. And to me, it's perfectly clear we need both. That if you're going to have areas which are set aside for wildlife, and I think we desperately do need such areas in infertile places which really are unsuitable for farming, where you've got 1 sheep per 2 hectares, 1 sheep per 5 hectares in some places, enough to get rid of all the trees, but not enough to produce anything like any reasonable amount of food. I mean, you've got a situation in Wales, for example, where 3/4 of the land area of Wales is producing meat. Wales imports by value 7 times as much meat as it exports. This is a crazy system. And when you look at the downstream effects, because all the trees have been stripped off the hills, when the rain falls on the hills, and it turns out to be untrue that the rain falls mostly on the plain, after living in mid-Wales for 5 years, I can testify that quite a lot of rain falls on the hills. That rain, without trees on the hills, just flashes straight off and causes floods downstream, which don't just take your carpets out, hit your buildings. It also takes out huge areas of land that is being farmed. And it's quite within the range of possibilities that highly destructive and highly unproductive upland farming actually destroys more food production than the food it creates.
So just very briefly, if we're going to have areas in places like that which seem eminently suitable for being set aside for wildlife rather than having farming there, that wildlife also has to move. It has to have a permeable landscape, wildlife corridors and all the rest, through which it can move from one place to another. Otherwise it becomes genetically isolated and it becomes inviable. And so farming of the kind that Chris does, farming of the kind that Colin advocates, and farming of the kind that Ed does, these are absolutely essential to make sense of the kind of large-scale rewilding areas that we're talking about. But small-scale ecological restoration is a necessary complement to the large-scale rewilding.
Colin, you wanted to add to that?
I just want to raise the possibility, and I think it is a real possibility, that it would be possible to manage or farm the uplands in ways which would basically be the ways of agroforestry, which would combine decent numbers of trees with decent numbers of sheep and therefore and other ungulates, and therefore would support communities, which is also very important to do. I think we just haven't thought about it enough, and I'm sure if we did, we could find a system that really works.
Thank you, Ed.
I'd just like to add a degree of cynicism about the economic arguments and the fact that people manage to find ways around each whatever's put upon them. What fascinates me is what has triggered Paul, what has triggered Charlie, what I know what triggered myself to get involved and do something that makes no economic sense at all. That's what we want to inspire people to do. Whatever resources they have is to be able to be willing and wanting to do things. Even if whether it's based on ecotourism, whether it's based on a competitive interest to show that or whether it's a social responsibility, whatever motivates people to engage, we need to find those trigger points. And I can assure you that economics is the last reason why anybody does anything.
Thank you. I think we have time for perhaps one or two more questions. I'm going to head for the... can I see you to the back?
Hello.
There's a gentleman right,
Hello.
Right here. Hello, there we are.
I'd like to offer I'm Scottish. I'd like to offer a small challenge to the panel and the people here. 3 years ago I did an MSc in Biodiversity, Wildlife and Ecosystem Health at Edinburgh University. And one of the things I learned, one of the biggest problems on the planet, which is unwilding a lot of things, is the human waste. So since then I have designed and made a composting toilet, and I would offer a challenge for you guys to not flush your toilet and to buy one of mine, £500, and anybody else in the room who wants it. And it's a very, very serious problem. We are flushing estrogen antibiotics into the water and the waste system, over-nutrifying the oceans and the rivers. And individually, we can all do something about that. So could I ask each individual member of the panel, will they not flush their toilet in 2016?
Well, I've got a reed bed. George, you're not going to flush?
I'm in the market for at least 3.
Yeah,
so I need your card.
Good.
Come on, have a serious question.
Oh, I'm going to pass on that one as well, literally.
Well, I do agree that the whole business of it, if I heard the question, I'm a bit deaf, but the whole you were asking about lavatories, aren't you? Excrement, all that stuff. I don't know about the 2016 bit, but there's no question this is one of the things that needs to be rethought from first principles. There's no question about that. As a matter of urgency, yes.
We also have a reed bed, fortunately. It seems like a good idea. It's on the back of the brewery. It doesn't work very well, but it's our own piece of marshland. It's 20 by 60, and usually in the winter months we have hen harriers overwintering it, which is rather spectacular.
Nice.
So it doesn't do any healthy or composting toilet or the problems of human waste, but it does sustain hen harriers over the winter.
Lady in the front here.
Hi, this is just an observation that the panel is completely made up of men. I'm interested to know, are there any women engaged in rewilding?
Very good
Where
point.
are they?
If I may...
Come on, Rebecca. Yeah. Alison, lots of people.
Easy. Many.
So why aren't they on the panel?
Many were asked.
Why did they say no?
We have to ask them.
Would you consider doing another one of these in
Absolutely.
the future full of women?
Yeah, absolutely.
Thank you.
No question. We will. I'm coming to that. There's a very, very important woman, and she will be named very shortly.
Can I just say that when we organised the Oxford Real Farming Conference, we try very hard to get as many women as possible. And it isn't easy because they're always collecting their kids from school and all that kind of stuff. I don't want to say it just happens to be a fact. And they were very retiring, you see. They tend not to push themselves on.
And George would like to make a comment too. I think we did this again, and I hope we will, in fact, in a year's time, and things will look rather different.
Well, I'd just like to say I do actually feel very uncomfortable about this. I don't think it's right. We're also in the second bloom of youth. And I think as a general principle, we should, and I know I'm not blaming the organisers at all because I really know they have tried, but as a general principle, we should be aiming for gender equality right the way across the board. And that applies to questions as well as panel responses too. So let's make sure we get some more women questions as well.
I think the board's appeal is to come forward, please, everybody. I think time for one more question from the audience. And it better be a woman. Is there a lady who's got a hand? There we go.
My name is Weezer, and I'm a priestess of Ursa. And in my spiritual practice, I have noticed a strong disconnect between the reality of the archetype of the bear and the wolf and whatever spirit guide is leading people, and their real connection to what is happening on the ground, the work that you guys, and yes, I honour you men, who are doing the work. And I would like to know how the spiritual world, the medicine women, the priestesses, the people who are working with the old archetypes that we have forgotten about, that we have lost our connection to, can connect to you guys. We would like to work with you. I hear the call for connection from the spiritual world.
Thank you. George.
Well, you know, one very interesting thing for me has been that my involvement with rewilding has led to a rewilding of myself, a rewilding of my mind, of my spirit, I would say, where I have life has become a lot more exciting for me. I've untapped or tapped into parts of my mind which I never knew existed before, and found, I would call it a spiritual enlightenment through much of this. I didn't really regard myself as someone with much of a spiritual life before. I was almost quite hostile towards it, but it's some of the experiences I've had, particularly kayaking with dolphins in Cardigan Bay. I mean, there was this remarkable moment where at one point I'd gone out in a very rough sea. It was a very stupid thing to do. It was probably the stupidest thing I'd done for a fortnight. And I was trying to get back in, and I was just looking for a break in the waves, and I couldn't see one, and I was beginning to panic, and suddenly I heard this horrendous rushing sound behind me, and I ducked, thinking an enormous wave was about to break over my head. And nothing happened. I looked round, and then this fin came up under the shaft of my paddle, very nearly touched the shaft, this great hooked, scarred, pitted fin, and then went down again. Though I knew what it was, there was a sort of moment of terror. And then I heard the great rushing noise again, and I turned round, and this male bottlenose dolphin, 13 feet long, the same length as my kayak, a monstrous dolphin, the biggest I've ever seen, leapt clean over my head. And as it did so, and it was just going back down again, its eye caught mine. It just looked out of the corner of my eye, and for that split second we were looking into each other's eyes. And suddenly, it was as if worlds opened up for me, which I was unaware of before. And it was a kind of spiritual awakening, which has gone alongside my intellectual and ecological reawakening through rewilding, that connection with nature can give us, which I believe is impossible to find in the same degree and the same style anywhere else. And I'm a better person for that. It changed my life.
When I talk about the vision we have for the European Nature Trust in the Highlands, I look at three main reasons for doing it. And the one that comes out top for me is ethically, morally, socially, it's the right thing to do. We extincted these species, and I think they should be back. And that's my main reason. But of course, the reasons that are probably going to make it happen are environmental reasons and the benefits from that, and more importantly even that is the financial reasons and the benefits for getting people to come and visit this area. But socially, morally, and ethically, I think it's the right thing to do, and that was my key driver. But to make it actually happen, we're going to have to go beyond that.
Charlie, can you add to that the idea of how spirituality is part of this journey?
With difficulty. I suppose that getting close to nature is what I find spiritually uplifting. I don't think you have connections with animals and things that are around you, and that has lightning bolts of reaction when you get particular behaviours or things that happen, but it's not, I'm a bit muddled about that.
May I contribute a little? As my entire life has been spent as a geek and somebody who's connected viscerally to what I call the real world, the natural world. And however you want to describe that, whether you call it spirituality, whether you call it an academic exercise, I don't really mind what you use as terminology. What I know for a fact is that it has made me happier, and it makes me very rich on a daily basis. I never spend a day without friends because I need only go outside the door and I hear them. Whether it's a long-tailed tit or a great tit or a tawny owl, they're all around. They're not literally, they don't come and have supper with me. But I'm connected to them because I know who they are. And I've gone beyond the academic exercise as a geek trying to learn their songs so that they just penetrate my consciousness on a regular basis. And if that's what spirituality is, then perhaps that's enough. And I think that what is desperately sad is there has been a gargantuan disconnect for not that many generations, actually, but probably at least 2, if not 3 generations in this country of people. And it's one of the things that I'm motivated to drive to change and to try and reconnect people, particularly younger people, to not simply understanding what's about them, but caring for it as a consequence. So I embrace your question. One more.
So I'm really glad that you ended on the idea of rewilding of us, because I think that's the most important part of this whole rewilding piece. Clearly you, white, middle-aged men, aren't going to solve this on your own. So what's the call to action? What can we do?
Let's start with Steve.
Well, I'm an educator, so I usually start my lecture, my 3rd year module on wilderness, with a phrase which goes something along the lines of, I've got usually about 40 students in the room. I say, if I get one of you to go on and do something for this planet, then I've won. And they all look at me blankly and think, no, I just want module credits. But usually one of them do. But I really like to go back to the lady's point there. I was preparing the answer in my head, and I think it's friends and people, that drive our energy and appreciation of things. We talk about it, and that's one of the things that we, as the so-called intelligent ape, have. That allows us to talk and communicate. So we need to communicate, to answer your question, and communicate across the board. And it's not just to the older people, but to the younger people coming up. I find experience, like George and everybody else here, that experience drives that. And I'm a scientist, and my kids will laugh at that. But I'm a scientist, and so I have this kind of science-based perspective on the world, but the more I talk to people, the more I realise that there is in fact something else. So I've just spent 3 wonderful weeks in the US talking to some people in Atlanta, but principally a couple of weeks in Mexico talking to a lovely lady and all her friends there about puma and conserving big cats in central Mexico. And if she's listening, thank you very much, Karina. You know, that, to my mind, it's about talking. So to paraphrase Stephen Hawking, we just got to keep talking.
Ed, if you, Colin, how do we start? What does everybody do?
Yes. I think, in a purely practical level, it's pity because there's other things besides practical things. But the practical thing is, I believe, very strongly in communities. One of the things we are doing in our own village, which is called Wolvercote, which is on the X of Oxford, it's really a neighbourhood, but it could be a neighbourhood or a village, is that we are talking about trying to acquire a community farm, a Wolvercote farm, village farm. And it could only be, if it's only 5 acres, that's okay. You could do a lot with 5 acres in terms of education, horticulture, and even small-scale livestock and so on. And that would probably, around where we live, cost an absolute fortune. But in most places, we might say about 50,000 quid. Well, £50,000 spread among the population of a village is not that great. And if you had 1,000 such villages around the country doing that kind of thing, that is a significant input. And it starts with people just deciding that they want to do it. It starts with people talking in pubs. And then they say, well, why don't we? And then they start doing it. In addition to that, though, very serious is that small mixed farms of the kind we need can't survive without appropriate markets. One of the things that anybody or any group of people could do is to set up a market to make it possible for small farmers to survive. And there's lots of movements around the country, which I've written about in a book that's coming out quite soon, that are basically cooperatives or associations between populations, local populations, villages and so on, and farmers in the surrounding area. And there are some that come out of London, I mean, the most counterintuitive place. And this kind of thing can be done. My advice, go down the pub, talk about it, do it.
Just to finish on the previous question, is that we talk an awful lot about human rights and we don't talk nearly enough about human responsibilities. And I think if we start looking at human responsibilities, we get much greater engagement with the planet that we live in. But as far as what you can do, is the first thing, I was fortunate, we filmed a whole session on Springwatch, that was the last on the series, and Chris Packham's comment at the end is that everybody in this room can help by looking for wildlife-friendly food and making that personal choice to support those farmers that are going away to make farming systems and the wildlife systems that we're looking for. So that's the first thing we can do. And the second thing is that within your area, there's standard methods that are used for benchmarking or for finding out baselines of what you have in your own community. And then from that, there's the significance to build that. And so that whatever might be happening in the planet or in the country is that if you know that your community is sound as a starting point, that gives us a great opportunity to build and spread the influence across the country.
Charlie?
2 organisations to support Rewilding Britain. I'm a trustee of. Helen Meach is in the audience here, who's the CEO, so find her. Client Earth, they're wanting to do some sterling work in changing legislation in the UK.
Paul?
We just recently been discussing a volunteer programme at Aldo, where hopefully we can get something out on that in the next 6 months. And regarding my other passion, which is Romania, go and visit it. It's very low cost, beautiful places to stay, amazing farming techniques, incredible forests, large landscapes, mega fauna, and it's not all that expensive, and Wizz Air fly there, so please go to Romania, that will help me.
George?
More like it'll help Romania and help us, sorry.
I think the key thing is to become informed and to help yourselves but the situation as well by actively going out and busting the myths with which we are constantly surrounded. I mean, we live in a world of lies, and those lies, I'm sorry to say, as someone who works for the industry, are constantly reinforced by the mainstream media. They're spread by the media, they're deliberately spread in many cases, and they're constantly rammed at us all the time. In particular, when it comes to environmental issues, rural issues, we are misled on an industrial scale. Either not told about the critical issues, or told about them in such a way as it completely distracts us from what the real drivers of those issues are. Now, I say go out and inform yourselves. Well, where do you start? Luckily, there are a whole lot of people out there, Chris is one of them, who are doing everything they can to try to redress that balance and to create alternative forums. I know that a lot of people in Frome are very interested in this, and actually saying, the world is not as it is portrayed to us by the corporate media. And on this particular issue, rewilding, the use of the land, these are critical questions which you will not find examined in the places that you might hope to find. With very few exceptions, you'll find almost no discussion of what we've been talking about this evening in the media. So use your own media, that is yourself, word of mouth, your own ability to write, your own social media forums to push that message out, in conjunction with people who are already working in the field. And take a look at the Rewilding Britain website, probably better than mobbing Helen after the event. Maybe she wants to be mobbed, but perhaps not. But and then use the information you glean from such places and from many other wonderful sources. I'm sure you know a lot, and just push it and push it and push it, and get it out there. Bypass the corrupt industry for which I work, and make the media your own.
Thank you so much. We are running out of time rapidly, ladies and gentlemen. Just before I thank those who have made everything possible, not least the panel, this evening, I'd just like to close with a few thoughts. George was just talking about this. We so often are waiting for a top-down policy, and we don't have to wait for top-down policy to change the way we live. We can just get on and do it. And here in Frome, you are proving that point. We see lifestyle changes all around us because of the decisions that we're making as a community of people. And that is beginning to have a very profound effect towards a sustainable future, I'm sure of that. What happens in Frome can happen anywhere. Let's make sure that the world hears about it. Fundamentally, every single one of us is empowered, and Colin mentioned this too, and it's a really very important point. You feel sometimes as though you're disenfranchised, but you've probably got 50p in your pocket, maybe even £1 if you're lucky. And what you do with that will dictate the course of the future. How you spend that money is profoundly affecting what happens tomorrow. You asking the right questions of where that money is going and how it's affecting the very resources that we all depend upon. And I should like to close before I close with thanks with a quote from Jonas Salk, who brought to our attention the fact that if tomorrow all insects were to pass away and die, then human beings would possibly have 50 years left on Earth. And if tomorrow human beings were to all disappear, then all of life on Earth would flourish. So there is no doubt that we need nature. It is our life support system. Now, I should like to, of course, thank everybody here and everybody watching. Hopefully you still are, if you're out there somewhere in the ether. And to Martina for this extraordinary, marvellous, earthly venue for hosting the event so great. Thanks, of course, to Southampton University, our partners, for helping promote this on a unique TV online opportunity. But I should also like to thank and ask to come to the front Jessica Rothwell, who's hiding at the back, who has brought this together. It's somebody mentioned, where are the women? Well, here's the woman. Jessica, please come forward. Because we need Jessica, in her, for the Voice of Nature. If you want to know more, go onto the Voice of Nature website. Jessica has been talking about this, bugging everyone, making sure it happened, and bringing it together. Congratulations. Without you, it simply wouldn't have happened. So thank you very much. And of course, thank you to each and every one of our panelists. And I'll hand over final words to Peter. Thank you.
Final words. So I'm a white middle-class old bloke, so I get a chance to say, just one thing which I'm really meant to be saying just good night and go. I just thought I would just say one other little thing that in a sense, I hope answers your question about what we should be doing. One of the things that's come up so often in this is a sort of local and global. And there've been little snippets of that go home and don't garden, which I really like. That whole, we can all be doing little things, but we could also be doing big things. And I think the biggest applause of the night, repeatedly, has been about big political issues that people care about. And I think I really hope that people will go away both feeling calm and, spiritual in their connections and go back and don't garden. But also, a little bit of anger would help. So I'm all for that. And, as a leader of town council, this of course doesn't apply to me, but you just might want to consider that inspiration from the Germans of shit on the law. Just to remind you of what Simon said, voiceofnature.co.uk. There'll be follow-up of these talks and so on through that. The bar will be open, and Mahesh, who is a truly wild citizen of Frome, will be serving vegetarian curry through there. So we really hope that people will stay, eat, drink, and continue the conversations into the night. And all that remains is for me to thank you again for coming. Thanks.
Okay, so here we are with Helen, the boss of Rewilding Britain. And Helen, after this fascinating talk, how would you define rewilding? What does rewilding actually mean?
Rewilding is all about the mass restoration of ecosystems. It's about giving nature the space it needs to thrive and survive. It's about restoring the vital life-giving services about which we all depend. And it's about reintroducing keystone species that create so much other life.
Thanks, and we've had some sort of insight there into what a wilder world might look like. What do we need to make that happen? What changes do we want to see to make Britain wilder?
For me, it's all about winning hearts and minds. So that's about giving people everyday lived experience of the wild. Everybody has a part to play, whether it's about rewilding your garden or supporting those who are trying to rewild at scale, making nature-friendly choices when you're buying food. So go out there and make a difference. Everyone can.
So all of us have stuff to do, and George Monbiot was pointing out how there's certain subsidies and policies in place that seem to be kind of pushing in the opposite direction. So is there a political aspect to it as well?
There absolutely is, and we'll be looking for significant policy changes over the coming years, and the 25-year plan for the environment is the first opportunity to do that, so we're seeking to engage DEFRA in that at the moment.
Amazing, brilliant. And what's the future for Rewilding Britain? It's just started. What an exciting organisation. What are you guys going to do?
It's very exciting. We'll be talking to a range of landowners who want to rewild, helping them to do that. And we're going to be talking to the public too. As I said, it's all about winning hearts and minds. So we'll be giving people information, inspiring debate, and getting people out there and rewilding their lives.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, Helen.
Thank you.
Hello, boss.
Hiya.
Derek, how did you enjoy that?
It was a very interesting evening. Many people were singing the stairs on the way up that they didn't know what to expect, and I think it's fair to say I didn't know what to expect.
And so after this evening, what does rewilding mean to you?
Well, I've worked in nature conservation and ecology for the past 25 years. I've been to Holland, I see some of the rewilding projects in the Netherlands. there they would use the words new nature rather than rewilding. Rewilding perhaps has a connotation of going back rather than looking forward. So it means that basically we have to change the pattern of the landscape that we have to create a landscape that's good for people, for farming, for other land use activities, but overall it gives us with an improving situation as far as nature is concerned, where it becomes more abundant and more diverse.
A lot of people here in this room want a wilder world, but how do we get there?
Well, it's a difficult thing and it takes a long time. One of the species I've worked with over the course of the last 20 years is the European beaver. There's been a lot of fuss about the reintroduction of beavers. Beavers are very important animals because they basically recreate landscapes which contain a huge amount of biodiversity and a huge amount of biomass. And by that, I mean very many frogs. And yet it's been such a challenging thing to do. It's a well-studied species, present throughout Europe, but at the end of it all, the political process, which has taken us to reintroduce a few populations of beavers in Britain, has been very, very difficult. So how do we get there? I'm not sure that we have the answers to that yet. When it comes to more contentious species, I think it's going to be very difficult.
Amazing. So we've been talking about rewilding nature, but also a little bit about rewilding ourselves. If people at home want to get wild, what should they do?
Well, I think rewilding ourselves is an interesting one. I'm not a spiritualist, but at the end of it all, I think if you're a gardener, you have an untidy garden. If you're a vegetable gardener, you leave space for the the caterpillars and the large white butterflies, so they can enjoy your brassicas too. It's a case of basically developing tolerance with regard to nature. In the past, we've always viewed anything that interferes with our interests as being a blight, as being a pest, as being vermin, something that we push out our way. Maybe we just, at the end of the day, in all our lives, need to show a bit more tolerance and a bit more respect.
Fair enough. And so are you saying that you'd be happy to live alongside wolves?
Well, you just asked the wrong person here, because I'm a sheep farmer. We farm about 1,500 ewes on the edge of Dartmoor. Would I like to go to bed hearing the howl of the wolf float through my window? Well, I'm going to go for my National Farmers Union Gold Lifetime Award here and say no. I don't think it's practical. Maybe an aspiration over time, and it might be something that in several lifetimes to come we can aim for. But there are many other things we can do besides that, which are much more realistic, which are much more politically and socially acceptable. And I think things like perhaps reintroduction of the white stork or the burbot, or perhaps even reintroduction of some of the very many amphibian species we lost, would be much more practical than the wolf.
Brilliant, thank you very much.
No problem.
Evening.
How are you doing?
I'm doing fine. It was a great evening, wasn't it?
Fantastic evening. So would you like the world to be a bit wilder? Would you like the UK to be wilder?
Definitely, and I think it's really achievable. I think what we're dealing with across, not just across the countryside, but also in towns and cities as well, is that we as public, if you like, we're fixated with vegetation being tidy in any case. I mean, I'm involved with lots of projects whereby what we're doing is basically unlocking biodiversity, and that's the way I see rewilding. Rewilding is unlocking biodiversity. So if you take species like, for example, the nightingale, which is, declined by 91%. Do a little bit of research on Google. What do you find its favourite habitat is? It's scrubland. And it's scrubs, the normal thing we're trying to get rid of because it's untidy, because it's in the way. So that's what I see as rewilding in that respect.
Amazing. So what other species would you like to see returning in numbers?
I think, if you're talking about reintroductions, like you were with Derek there, Derek was on a bit of a field day there. Beaver, definitely. Why aren't we just getting on with it? Lynx is definitely a go. Wolf, I'm a little bit suspect about, and that's simply because of space. I mean, I've actually tracked wolves as a part of a programme I present on Radio 4 called The Living World, and we've actually tracked wolves there. And one thing that the scientists in Sweden were saying to me is that the problem in the UK is that if you release wolves into the Cairngorms, even within a few weeks, they could be in Hyde Park. That's what they do. They just roam. They roam around. So that bit's difficult. And I think all reintroductions should be looked at scientifically. But one thing I think we conservationists are very bad at is taking risks. We don't like taking risks. And so one of the things I'm trying to introduce is that ethos of take the risk. Use science. We've got that wonderful tool called science to actually study it in the first place. And once we've done our research, we've done our science, look at the data, and then we'll see whether it really is going to work or not. But again, with the wolf, of course, comes other species. A bit like with the beaver, it's a keystone species, and we need those keystone species.
So what would the beaver and the lynx do for us?
Well, it's already been said that they're keystone species. So for the beaver, for example, I've seen it myself. I've seen it across Europe, and I've seen it in trials that the Devon Wildlife Trust have done up on Dartmoor with recreation of calm grassland. And when they first introduced the beavers, and this is an enclosed area, but when they first introduced the beavers set to work reducing the amount of vegetation so the calm grassland could come through. But what they didn't do was what we do with scrub, and that's eradicate it. They started farming it so it would grow again. And suddenly they produced these little splash pools, which were really exciting. And suddenly the researchers were saying, wow, we've got great crested newt, we've got smooth newt, we've got common newt, we've got frogs, we've got toads. Why? Because the beavers are there. And that's a keystone species, and those are the species we need back.
Amazing. So the people here, we want a wilder world, but it seems like we're up against dodgy policy and maybe corporate problems as well. What can we do to make the world wilder?
We're up against more problems than just that. We're also up against a mindset, and the mindset, obviously, not just out there, but within the conservation world as well. We've got to get around that. Let's set up some areas. Let's try experimenting. That's what this is all about. Experiment. Leave some areas completely. Let them to run through succession. So you go from short grassland to long grassland, you go into scrubland, you go into woodland, you go into forest. Study the lot. And let's do things for biodiversity. That's what we want back. We want wildlife back in its entirety.
Amazing. So can we do it? Are you optimistic about the future?
Of course we can. Of course we can. And I'm going to go away from here tonight, and I am going to start.
Brilliant. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Yeah. Oh, sorry. Right.
How's it going? How did you enjoy this evening?
I thought it was fantastic. I thought this evening was fantastic. Yeah, amazing energy, wonderful speakers, not enough from the floor, too many white middle-class men. Yeah, that was a problem for sure. Too many posh rich people on the panel. You know, for me, I wanted to ask the anti-capitalist question, which is like, you know, really, if we're going to rewild the world, we need to redistribute power.
Why is that?
Because, you know, you've got three very wealthy guys on the panel there who are talking about doing something nice for society because they can afford to do it. But most rich people don't give a fuck and are not going to do that for people. And they own, you know, like 2%, 1% of the population of the planet control and own most of the planet. So actually, if we're really going to rewild society and the globe and the economy, we need to redistribute power and resources and land. So that would be my challenge, because everyone was agreeing, and I think I'm always suspicious when everyone agrees, right? And actually, I know George Monbiot, for instance, totally agrees with me on these issues. So, you know, if we'd gone on a bit longer, I would have put a bit of anti-capitalist magic dust into the conversation just to see what that stirred up.
Yeah, why not? And I suppose, you know, richer people own land. And so I suppose the question is, to people that don't own land, they don't have so much money, what does rewilding mean to them?
Well, I mean, fundamentally, I think it's about not having richer people anymore, and I think that's entirely possible. You know, the 99% have an interest in us shifting to a unequal world. So, you know, my neighbour nudged me during the debate, and he was like, is that guy, is he Corbyn's, at one point, Colin Tudge said a few things which were a little bit kind of political, and he was like, is that Corbyn's brother? You know, and I was like, that's what it's about, really. There's Corbynomics in this, in a way, you know, so...
Fascinating, so rewilding is political?
Rewilding has to be political. Everything has to be political. Everything is political. Political is the dialogue between us citizens about the future we want to create. That is politics. And we're all part of that. And it's not about politicians in Westminster and who we vote for. It's about flat patch democracy, which is what they're doing here in Frome, but writ large. It's about P2P economy and P2P politics, you know, and that has to be part of every debate, including the rewilding debate. And it's about the rewilding of ourselves and the repoliticising of ourselves in a wild way. Without wanting to say that we should tear down the the ramparts and bring out the guillotine. We can do this in a peaceful way, but we've got to get wild. Yeah, but we've got to have fun. Wild to me means fun as well. It's a celebration of what can be.
Fantastic, and obviously Frome, where we are, Frome Council is very interesting politically. So, do you think that Frome can lead the way with rewilding?
I think Frome, and for me, I mean, that's part of the reason I live around here, is that Frome, Bristol, the bioregion of Bristol, Bath, Somerset, Wiltshire, there's a lot of stuff going on here. Transition towns in Totnes, River Cottage, in terms of their connection with food and society, the Bristol Pound, Flat Pack Democracy, Happy City in Bristol, the Real Economy Lab that I am the convener of. There's a whole load of stuff that's going on in this area. So yeah, I think this is kind of the pulsing heart of the new economy.
Fantastic, let's make it happen.
Yes.
Thank you.
Okay. Thank you.
Sharon, how did you enjoy this evening? How was that?
It was actually a lot better than I anticipated. I'm a natural skeptic. I guess I thought there might be an obsession just with carnivores and reintroducing wolves and all the rest, but actually there was a much more balanced feel about it, a lot more in terms of ecosystem restoration, which I think for me has to be the focus, because without that you can't really do anything else constructive around rewilding.
So what does rewilding mean to you? What's the kind of definition you'd walk away from this evening with?
I think for me it still has to be about really fundamental ecosystem processes and about trying to have ecosystems in as natural a state as possible. I mean, I understand the need for, predators and for carnivores within that system, but I think until we can do the fundamental basics, then you can't do that. I think the other thing that's really important, and I'm really glad came up quite a few times, was the need for a community involvement and for community-led approaches on smaller scales. Because I was a bit concerned, we've got big landowners here and their interests obviously are going to be quite different from those of your average person. And so it was good to see that there was due consideration from some of the speakers as to local issues and local community involvement.
Great. Now, in the room today we had a lot of enthusiasts, but a lot of people at home might feel, what does nature do for me? Why do I need wild land? What do we communicate to those people?
I think you underestimate people sometimes. I think everyone actually does have a sense of what nature gives them. And I'm saying everybody, I'm speaking from the context of the communities that I live in. I guess there are lots of communities maybe that don't have that same access to nature and don't have an understanding of it. But it only takes you to sit in a closed room with no access to your fridge to realise that it doesn't take very long for you to need something that is from nature. So even do an experiment for yourself, close yourself off for a couple of days, don't get fresh air, don't turn on the tap to get water that's come from local streams. Don't do these things and you'll realise very quickly that your quality of life declines very rapidly.
Fantastic. Now, what do we need to do to make the world wilder? What do we need to do to protect nature?
There's a lot of different answers to that. If you were taking a very radical approach, then I guess in some ways we need to clear more land to allow nature to do what it's supposed to do, rather than constantly trying to overmanage and try to overthink things in some respects. But of course in the real world it's not an option, so there are always going to be some kind of compromises, and I think for me the most important thing is that those compromises don't squash the people at the bottom. They don't take from those who have so little already, in order for people, in fact like our speakers who are from the rich Western world. It's all very nice for them to have ideas, but don't let those ideas squash those who don't have something to begin with.
Fantastic, thank you very much.
Okay, no problem.
Right, what are you going to ask?
You're going to stand there, you'll find out.
Okay, go.
Ready? Jessica, fantastic evening. How do you feel that went?
I'm absolutely delighted. I think everyone spoke about what needed to happen, and it's really not one individual. It's about the combination of what we're talking about here. And each of them really hit that home. And not only that, I think it's created an energy which is going to inspire people to move on. And it's all about opening the conversation. And the conversation had to be about what nature needs, not what we need. And I think now we're going to find our place within that. And I think that's what it's all about. So I'm really pleased.
So after this evening and the discussion, has it changed your perception of what rewilding is? What does rewilding mean to you?
Rewilding for me is making space for the systems to actually flourish. The ones that we have, I think there's about 5% left of the UK in which ecosystems can even begin to behave as they should. That's not enough. I mean, there's talk of it being more realistically should be about 66%. But even if we got to 30%, it would be a huge progressive step compared to where we are now. And I think, you know, as long as we can start paving the way towards that, I think, you know, we've got a bit of hope. The sooner the better, really.
Amazing.
And a lot of courage required to do it, but, you know, courage is simple. When you get some energy behind something, I think the rest will fall into place.
Amazing. Now, I can tell that you have a vision of a wilder world. How would that wilder world be better for people?
I think one of the very, very base levels of how that would be answered would be, at the moment we're faced with doom and gloom and it's a bit depressing. And if we started doing the right things, those conversations would very, very quickly change towards progressive news coverage, towards what we were achieving, towards what we should be doing, not about what's going wrong on a daily basis incessantly. I, for one, have almost stopped watching the news. It's not interesting, it's not progressive, it's all holding us back. And I think, for me, going forward, be one of the main reasons for all of this. We'd be changing the whole discourse of how we operate.
Fantastic. So, we want the wilder world. How are we going to get there?
I think a lot of it's been touched on tonight. Education, policy change, individuals driving the change themselves, not accepting anything for what it is currently, and being completely free thinking about how we need to go about solving a problem. Taking the individual ego out and putting the collective requirements in. I think that's where we need to go.
Fantastic. And a final question, how can we get more women into rewilding?
I feel really bad about that. It's all my doing. These people were chosen on merit, and I think it's not about... there's no sexism on that agenda. That was purely a reflection of how our society works. You know, we've got lots of men spearheading, and there's a hell of a lot of women behind each of those men. So really, it's just a reflection of how society is functioning.
Fantastic. Well, next year we'll get more women up there.
Definitely.
Thank you.
With a bit of training.
Definitely you.
Thanks very much.
Thanks.
Call of the century to my world.
Yeah, all went well.
Surprising how heavy this gets up. Bring love, never dominion to my Lord, my shepherd is never dominion to the snow. You and I bring love, never to let